So hello everyone. Again, my name is Brian Poteet. So just a little bit about me. Product manager at Edifecs. I've been with Edifecs about a year, but prior to that, I was with Blue of Tennessee for 17 years, implementing provider-facing solutions, doing a lot of work in the 27X EDI real-time space, implementing portals, spending a lot of time in the provider community, as well as working on the payer complexities of back-end systems, care management, et cetera. So I have a lot of background and have walked in the shoes of lots of folks, I'm sure, in this room and on the calls today. So looking forward to sharing kind of what we're working on here at Edifecs and taking any questions about our kind of view of the prior authorization world. So obviously, prior auth is at the forefront of lots of discussions that we've been on. There's obviously a compliance angle. There is a business angle, right? How can I actually save money, but also do right by my patients? And ultimately, that kind of puts you down to these questions of, well, what strategies can I actually use to really get value, kind of start moving the needle, but at the same time understanding that it's a long process, right? There's going to be a lot of challenges, and how do you actually gain value from your existing infrastructure, but at the same time, don't kind of throw things out just because if they've been working for many years, why not leverage that capability so that then you can get value while you're building towards the future? So, looking at the implementation guides, we've seen presentations today, lots of talk about how these exchanges work. So I'm not going to go into a ton of that other than to say that it's very logical, right? If you look at how these transactions work, one thing starts, the prior auth check. Then that moves down and says, okay, if the prior auth check has been completed, then how can I actually, ensure that that information flows to the user? And then once that gets in front of the user, how do I actually ensure that, hey, they're actually taking the next step? And is it collecting the data to pre-fill, to prevent all of those things downstream as far as rekeying data that's already in the EHR? So as far as how the specification is written, makes total sense, right? And I think we'd all agree that it is moving towards the direction that can really make a real change in the industry. Now, the problem is the real world, right? So the real world is tough because you have many entrenched processes that have been around for many, many, many years. You've got a varying degree of support for the standards, and it doesn't matter whether or not the standard is in effect. We could be past the compliance date. It doesn't mean that all the systems in your particular population of payers, of providers, is actually going to support those transactions. And it doesn't mean that they're going to support it anytime soon. It also doesn't mean that the data is clean enough to even leverage those standards, right? If you have many processes that are still based upon collection of unstructured data, yes, you have the data, but do you actually have tools to mine out what you need to actually drive a proper automation process? And then on the flip, just looking at the business challenges, right? You've got a provider that is on a timeline of implementing prior authorization that is governed by their own resource constraints, as well as the technology resource constraints, or technology and resource constraints of their vendor, right? So what timeline are they on? And does that timeline mesh conversely with the payer's timeline of the ability to support the different environments that they're actually implementing within? If you've got a state with 5 or 6 different health systems, all with different EHRs, they all may have their own idiosyncrasies that are going to require ongoing support from those payers and or intermediaries, as lots have brought up, throughout that entire transition period and even beyond. So the devil's in the details, right? It's how do you actually implement point solutions that can truly make the process better with a mind towards the future of true automation at the highest scale. So looking at the current process, we see, does a member need prior auth? First thing that the provider staff has to do is say, okay, which payer is this? What pathway am I going down to figure out what even these requirements are, right? Then they're working with internal clinical staff to say, okay, I know the requirements are this. Do we have that information? And then let's say they don't have that information, or they're not sure about what information to provide. Now you're dealing with a communication, oftentimes between the clinical staff and the plan staff to understand, okay, what documentation do you actually need? It could also be from the front office staff dealing with coverage matters about, is this actually part of their benefit plan? So there's a lot of back and forth that can actually even happen to even answer that simple question of, does he need prior auth? So that leads to delay, that leads to frustration. There's cost for everybody involved because you're dealing with all of these manual exchanges. Meanwhile, the patient is just stuck there without any answer whatsoever. And then when they do get an answer, they may have to repeat that whole thing over again if all of that didn't successfully happen on the front side. So I think we're all familiar with that, but just kind of laying out that at the end of the day, the current process really puts the patient at paying the cost of that delay. So some of the things that we've heard from our customers when we've talked about this in different working groups throughout the industry is, well, gee, there's all these barriers, right? So when we looked at this, we said, well, how do we turn these barriers into strengths, right? Interviewing 101. If you've got a weakness, turn it into a strength. So how can we do that? So providers aren't often even not using the portals that are there for one reason or another. I remember working with a hospital. They would use a portal to do follow-up submissions, but they wouldn't do initial submissions. Well, it was because their initial submissions were coming out of a legacy system that had all of the records scanned that hadn't actually been codified yet. So it didn't make sense for them to spend all the time to hand codify all that stuff. But on the update side, it made perfect sense because they could just go find one page from a record, send that through. So they kind of had this hybrid solution. It's like, well, how do I get you to use the portal? Well, maybe it doesn't even make sense for them to use the portal if the next step in the process is getting actual codified discrete data elements into the EMR. So it's about focusing on the thing that you can reliably get the users to do, but while at the same time understanding that even if you're sacrificing some of that efficiency now, it's going to pay off later. So documentation is excessive or inaccurate, right? So this goes back to how do we actually get the benefit of that documentation? If I'm getting a lot of documentation, maybe the best way to invest in a strategy to look at that documentation is through some NLP technology to actually say, okay, let me recognize the data that's in there to try and feed that into the structures that the implementation guides are actually recommending for documentation, so that then maybe I can actually build some pre-fill capability, because at the end of the day, those faxes aren't going away, at least not anytime soon. So as much as we want to get rid of the fax machine, maybe there's a better technology investment that you can make to actually gain value from that traffic because it's not like nobody's working towards the future. Everybody wants to get to a better place, but it's a question of, can I get value now versus later? Or in the best case, now and later. So many submissions are made via fax and phone. Again, can I take that pipeline, which you've already done probably some automation on today, maybe combine it with some of those NLP items I was talking about before to actually truly feed that authorization data into one unified stream on your review backend. So again, figuring out, instead of focusing on, why can't I just make this go away? How do I turn it to my advantage? Clinician burnout, right? This gets into, how can I simplify the process, right? If there is a very long form that has to be filled out over and over and over again, it always requires clinician review. At the end of the day, you're not helping anybody, and there's an opportunity there to turn that burnout around. So look for ways to actually simplify business processes. Look for ways to actually use the data that's already in the system through the EHR interchanges. So the high cost for utilization management. Again, if you take some of the steps to automate some of your back-end processes, that can reduce that cost. Pre-filling the data, following the implementation guides will also, in the long run, decrease those costs for review, because now you're not having to scan through records. Maybe you've got an NLP engine that can do highlighting to help the reviewers actually look and say, oh, our policy says this. So it's that type of thinking of existing process along with new technologies that can help. So, and then avoiding cost increases, right? Can you provide toolings that allow the users at the payer side not to increase their spend on managing policies and creating all of these machine readable artifacts that have to actually go into these automation steps, right? There's a big concern for many of the payers we've talked to that say, well, we agree, but if we have to increase staff on one side just to maintain all of the actual questionnaires and CQL logic and things like that, you're really not giving me any net benefit because I've just moved costs from one bucket to another. So you've got to also look at what are the strategies that I can do to streamline the authoring of that content so that you don't end up with a great solution that can't be supported from an operational perspective. So in the future world, right, we know, does he need prior auth? Now through our solution, we've got a mechanism to assist the payer in actually codifying those rules into NLP executable reviews, so that then that way we can look and say, okay, your policy says this, these are the clinical data elements that you should be looking for, here's the things that we recommend, here's the questions that we can even derive from looking at that, right? So we're able to give the payers the ability to kind of, I won't say shortcut, but I will say significantly reduce the amount of time through smart integration of that NLP technology that we're already using in many of our other product lines. So now we know prior auth isn't needed. Now the patient's getting an answer right then. Everybody's happy. They can move on with the service. So you see an initial benefit just from that investment of looking at your policy details and understanding here's the actual clinical data that these policies represent, being able to integrate that back to your CRD response so that you can give the most accurate answer to the user in real time in their EHR. So now if we're looking at when prior auth is required, again, we can leverage that same extraction that we've done from the policy standpoint in pre-filling the questionnaires that have been built. So now we know what medical terminology, SNOMED codes, CPT codes, whatever it is that your policies represent. Now we can say, okay, let's take that, let's build the FHIR infrastructure to dip in, run the CQL to pull that data out. And obviously that provides benefits for auto adjudication because now you can build rules and say, oh, this value for this tumor size is over a certain amount, or this value for this O2 SAT is under a certain amount, so on and so forth. So that's where doing that investment up front around the tools that you're going to have anyway from a payer perspective really starts paying off, because it gets you that much further down the line when you're actually going and trying to get the data. And then obviously, if you end up in a denial situation, the integrations that you've built for the EHRs at that point to push those notifications into the approval or the denial back into the EHR, each step builds on the next so that ultimately you are providing the best solution for your patients, first and foremost, but also your providers and hopefully your reviewing staff. So if we look, just say hypothetically, right? And the reason that we're kind of harping on this whole idea of be holistic in your view of prior authorization is, let's say we're in a world today where if we got a mandate and we could implement over the next 2 years, 2% would be ready today. That still leaves much of your traffic in manual channels, right? So it's not really addressing the cost factor that goes into maintaining all of those existing channels. But now let's fast forward, say 2-3 years past the date. In my experience, implementing new transactions, getting providers to change behaviors, it's not as simple as here's this thing that's better, right? And even if you achieve 50% automation, you'd be very happy from a plan perspective. But the amount of staff that you would need to support the reviews may not be significantly different between 50% of manual channels and 80% of manual channels, right? So it's about understanding how I can take the technologies not only afforded by the implementation guides, but other technologies that you can take, such as OCR or NLP, automating or translating manual transactions into standard ones through a unified backend that could actually yield more opportunities for you to save cost along the way until the rising tide lifts all boats, as you will. So if you look at the backside of this, that's kind of what we're trying to show is that you can leverage AI. You can say, okay, I'm seeing from these providers, 50% of the time, these forms are going through and sailing through with approval. So maybe I can adjust my authorization requirements for this provider. And because I have a rules engine that I've built as part of the new standards, I can implement those rules, but as long as I have a unified backend, I can apply them to whatever pathway and whatever channel that we're getting that data through. Same idea for portals, right? If you've got existing portals, those are not likely to go anywhere anytime soon. You can do the same thing. As long as you can get that data into a standardized format, preferably moving towards where the recommended burden reduction guides are taking us, the better you are for the future. So, and then it becomes much easier to implement AI, NLP, machine learning, all those buzzwords that you hear. They're actually actionable because now you actually have data that you can feed through those models. So just building this slide out a little bit. If we start here with our providers, our high-tech providers with FHIR, our providers with legacy EMRs, and our providers without EMRs, they can all interact on their own terms, right? They can say, okay, with Edifecs solution as my intermediary, if you will, or representing the health plan, then we can take that FHIR-enabled solution because our boundary is completely FHIR-enabled. We can use the standard transactions. That's the easiest path forward, right? But then you have legacy EMRs that may have standardized transactions, but maybe they're standardized to a version of the 278 that hasn't been, fully adopted by the health plan. Or maybe they've adopted the 278, but they don't have as many automation capabilities. From this standpoint, as long as we can get the data in and run that against the standard format that our solution using the FHIR tech is actually able to do, then it doesn't necessarily matter. Yes, there's more integration work up front, but that's probably going to be there anyway. And then lastly, taking the manual channels, the portals, the OCR vendors, anywhere where you're getting those data streams. And for the keen-eyed among you, you'll notice that my 3 and 4 got chopped off whenever I pasted this. But essentially, steps 3 and 4 are really talking about the same thing, whether it is data that you're OCRing and providing a structured format for, or whether it is data that you already got a structured format, you just need to do some transformation to get it into the same structured format that the backend supports, then we can run all the same rules that we're building out as part of our standard solution. So again, just kind of taking a long view and saying, all right, how long am I going to have to live with all of these solutions, and can I actually get any sort of return on investment? And honestly, can I bite off these implementation steps just like they were talking about before with starting with CRD? Maybe that's your plan strategy. You start with CRD. How do we take that across our entire stack? We can handle that. Or we could say, hey, let's do top to bottom with a single provider or one provider health system. Do that as well. So depending upon the different ways that you could slice that implementation, that's all doable within this sort of framework as well, because it's just a question of how deep you're going and how wide you're going in each context. So what I'm going to talk about here is our demo, and let me tell if it's playing automatically. So let me lay out the scenario a little bit. Imagine you're a provider that has to do authorization submissions across many different payers, across many different formats. And we'll say, for sake of argument, that you've implemented the Edifecs Smart on FHIR application as kind of your first stepping stone. But you still got other forms that you've got to fill out, and you've got a process for that takes and consolidates all those to your outbound fax queue. So what I'm going to show is the ability of our solution to actually take that data in from that external format, show where we are able to kind of display to the reviewers on the payer side how the document was analyzed against their own medical policy to assist them in the review, but also then show back to the user how they can get status across all of their authorizations. So it's really a kind of envisioning a situation where you've got one of these providers that's kind of in this in-between phase where everything isn't supported. So they're dealing with multiple different channels of submissions, and how our solution can actually show all of that data back to the user in one single format. And then we'll talk a little bit about the whole Smart on Fire idea and how that's being delivered after we get through this. So try to play. There we go. So you see here we've got a couple of fax auth submissions that we're going to submit to our inbound queue. So as those are processing, I'm going to go back as the reviewer, and I'm going to say, okay, what authorizations do I still need to work on while those are processing? So I'm going to pull up my Smart on Fire application. Imagine there's a link in their EHR that takes them to this. We have access to all of the signed orders using the specifications. So all the interactions that you're seeing within our application, we're actually leveraging the Fire standards. So the prior authorizations are pass bundles. The signed orders are, in fact, coming from CRD transactions. So here, this is an authorization that I'd submitted previously that had gotten processed in, and some of the data was pre-filled, but not all of it. So using the questionnaire resource, I'm rendering that locally. I'm filling in the rest of the data that this plan needs according to their policy, and then I'm going to actually submit that for review. So you can see right off the bat that this kind of solves that problem of what if a fax is incomplete? Well, we can kind of help get that data complete by feeding that back to the user for some additional correction in line. So now I have this prior authorization ready to submit. I'm going to go back and look. Now I'm looking at the payer side of the experience. So I, as the payer, I don't have any authorizations in my review queue. This is just our standard review interface. It's not meant to replace any of the major review systems, but it does help us emulate those steps. And you can see in the background there that we've got a policy management repository that's actually keeping track of which policies apply to which procedure codes. And you can see also that those faxes have disappeared from the intake queue. So I'm going to go ahead and submit this authorization from the provider's perspective. I was able to get an immediate approval because I was able to submit this to the plan, and the plan supported automation via the automated approval based upon the data that I was able to grab from their fax. And if you can see here, this is a payer reviewer reviewing that fax, and it is showing them here's all the data that Edifecs extracted from that fax and was actually part of the prior authorization bundle that got posted back to your system. So again, it's giving them these tools, and again, us being Edifecs, we could put these transactions anywhere based upon whatever implementation environment. This is just the easiest way for us to show this. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to look and say, all right, what about that other one that I already submitted? Do I need to take any action on that? Yes. So now I see that authorization showed up in my queue. This is the same interface that they would see whether or not those orders were flowing in directly from fully Fire CRD enabled payers or not. They're able to do the pre-fills just as they would with any questionnaire and review and submit. Now in this case, when they submit, this is a pending scenario. So in this scenario, they can actually go back and say, okay, let me continue with my other work while the payer is actually going through and completing their review. So if we flip back to the payer side here, now I can see the pending review authorization from the payer side. I can assign that, work that in my tool. Again, this is going to vary depending upon the payer. But now I can actually also see that data just the same as I saw after it was approved. I can see it in real time while it's being worked. So I can see the data that was submitted on the Fire bundle, but I can also see, okay, here's the additional attachment that was referenced in that bundle. Here is the actual form. This is a form I'm familiar with as the payer. I can see the data that's been highlighted. So I'm comfortable with what I'm seeing here. Maybe it was just a typo in what the user entered. Could happen to anybody, right? So they're going to go ahead and render the decision. Now this final decision flows directly back to the user in our Smart on Fire application, or can be pushed back to the EHR depending upon the EHR's capability. And so then that way the user sees exactly what transpired and can actually make sense of what's happening with their whole prior authorization journey. So we'll go back to the provider side. Now they can see that that approval has been rendered in the system. And you can see the message, the prior authorization is approved, that was entered by the review on the payer side. So this is just kind of a vision of how this can work. Again, it's not meant to be prescriptive. Every situation is going to be different. You know, back to the comments about the Smart on Fire. Yes, is it another interface that a user has to learn if it's Smart on Fire? It is, but because we have interfaces within Smart on Fire that are actually following the implementation guide, we can easily expose those interfaces to do the exchange natively once the EHR is ready. So we're providing options for implementation regardless of the state whenever the provider or the payer is ready to take this burden on and actually try to gain some true ROI from implementing technology around prior auth. So it's the thing we like to look at when we talk about this internally. It's not just about the transactions and the technology. It's also about the process, right? And process is king, right? That's how many people get trained. You're bringing on staff. They have to understand how these systems interact. And it's much harder, in my experience, to move people off of process than it is to move to new technology. So we're trying to give solutions that allow users to meet where those processes are, so that way it doesn't matter that you can't move 80% of your providers off of that process. Maybe you can get some benefit, and then, you know, down the line, whenever those providers and their technology landscape is catching up, you'll be ready and you'll recognize those savings at that point in time. So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to say that the implementation guides are ready to go. They are developing standard. You know, many of the things that are happening on a daily basis on those calls are things that we're taking back and integrating back into our products. So it is something that we are actively invested in, making sure is truly being leveraged in the industry, but also recognizing that things aren't perfect always, and we can deliver solutions that can meet that burden. So with that, that's all that I had. But if there are questions, I think I've got a few minutes here to handle questions. So.
Thank you, Brian. We're going to go to the virtual audience for their question.
How did Edifecs know what data to extract from the facts?
Sure. So that's a combination of looking at, we would work with the payer. We've got some OCR technology that we already use on our risk adjustment space that can do medical term recognition. So we run it through those engines to understand what that terminology is, how that maps to SNOMED, CPT, whatever. So we already got technology in that space, and it's just a matter of understanding, okay, this form layout for this payer is here, so we need to code our offsets this way, et cetera. So there is some effort there, but at the end of the day, it's effort that can be used very quickly by a reviewer that already has a process that is built on reviewing an unstructured document like that.
Just to follow up on that question on the virtual chat, and how did the payer get the provider that submitted a fax to now work through a portal? Isn't there avoidance of portals the reason they sent the fax in the first place?
Yeah, great question. So in our scenario, the assumption is that they have implemented the Edifecs Smart on Fire application as kind of an add-on to their existing EHR. To your point, though, if they don't have that, the payer still would get the benefit of reviewing that technology if they had that extraction from the NLP engine if they had implemented Edifecs solution on the payer side only. So there's still some benefit to be gained by enhancing the ingestion portal, even if the provider hasn't implemented Edifecs on there.
Excellent. We do have a question here in Chicago.
Hello.
Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Mike, I have two questions for you. The first one, piggyback on the codification of the information you're getting from the instructor document. What happens when you have the idea of something that won't fit a SNOMED code? It would be more like a post combinatorial SNOMED code. have you run into that scenario? Because that actually happens pretty frequently, I'm thinking.
Yeah, so yes, what basically what we'd have to do is we'd have to say, okay, what is the actual, this is where the payer policy setup becomes critical, because at the end of the day, we have to understand what data is the payer actually looking for to execute whatever rules they're going to apply for this authorization type, right? So as long as we can define those rules, then we can define, codified extraction logic using the CQL library to say, okay, even if I'm not getting these SNOMED codes, maybe I can do a separate scan to say, am I seeing anything that indicates these ICD codes, which might be equivalent? Things like that. There's different things that we can do to try to put together all the pieces that would be able to execute that rule. But to your point, nothing's ever going to be perfect in this world, and that's why, from the provider's perspective, implementing a solution like the Smart on Fire that could actually render the questionnaire in real time based upon the resulting pre-fill of rules we've executed, they've at least saved a little time to say, oh, okay, they couldn't get that answer. Let me go ahead and put that in and submit it. So, it's never going to be perfect. That's just the nature of unstructured data, but we're trying to give as many hooks as possible to get value on either side of the chain as we can.
My second question is in regard to the questionnaire. When you are having the provider attest to that information, are you receiving any pushback on just asking the provider to attest for information that you couldn't find?
Not with the providers that we've worked with so far. That really hasn't been an issue. I mean, I think many of the ones we've heard from that are really ready to do something in this space are ready to change their processes. So they're willing to take on some of that risk. I mean, obviously that's going to be provider specific and service specific and how much data they're collecting from whom, right? Especially if it's coming from other providers that they've pulled into their EHR, things like that. So there probably is some effort around the attestation and the provenance side of things that could be done to kind of give that level of comfort to physicians if they weren't comfortable with the testing from that extraction, kind of showing them the sourcing of that information, things like that. They could say, okay, this came from this record in my EHR, to help them along that. But that's something I think we'll all have to deal with at some point, because it's a change, right? We're going from, hey, I know exactly what this document is, to, hey, I'm trusting that this data is in my system, right? So.
Any questions here in Chicago? All right, I'd like to thank Brian and our friends at Edifecs for another great tech showcase.
Thank you.